But first, after a year of rallying around governments that keep us safe from a virus, as we've seen recent state elections and, of course, in the polls, the conventional wisdom is that Scott Morrison will easily win the next federal election, which could occur at the back end of this year. And that, of course, Labor, too, is unelectable, they say, largely because it's hopelessly split between its inner-city-based Green left and its old blue-collar constituency concentrated in the outer suburbs and our regions. I'm not saying that Scott Morrison won't win or that Labor isn't split. Clearly, it's Morrison's election to lose, and Anthony Albanese is now, as I see it, in a leadership death spiral. But that's only part of it, because decent political analysis appreciates that things are usually more complicated than conventional wisdom allows, and the split apparent today between inner-city Liberals and country-based Nationals shows that the divide between the so-called progressives and so-called conservatives isn't just on the Labor side. It's all very well for leafy suburb Liberals like Trent Zimmerman, Jason Falinski and Tim Wilson to patronisingly dismiss the Nationals' call for more manufacturing jobs based on cheap energy, including coal-fired power. But the inescapable reality is that Liberals only form government because Nationals give them the numbers to do so. And the Nationals are increasingly restless, not just at the Liberals' leftward drift, very much pronounced, as you know, at state level too. Ministers in New South Wales like Matt Keane are, they're a pertinent example. But also, we're all alive today to the perceived slights inside the coalition. Barnaby Joyce in the Australian newspaper this morning, resentful at what he claims are thin pickings for Nationals when it comes to heavyweight ministries. Now, sure, this is a bit of a good measure of Joyce sour grapes, but he's not alone in this view.
Michael goes into a meeting, I don't know what it is, 8 o'clock, 8:30 every day with the Prime Minister, and he doesn't want the aggro, he doesn't want, he wants the hail fellow well met, and he doesn't want the aggro in Cabinet, and so other people will say the bleeding obvious, and I think I have a position to do that, being father of the National Party, longest serving member and a former leader, and I'm going to say what we've been saying privately, because we want this dealt with.
Just because Scott Morrison is doing well doesn't mean the coalition is unassailable. On the personnel and the policy front, there's plenty of room for improvement. That's because the truth is, the only way to run a successful government is to make decisions and to implement them, to get things done, in other words. And while the federal government has done a very good job of managing the pandemic, helped, of course, by our island status and early quarantine of international travellers, for a government now in its 8th year, there's been a lot more minding the shop than there's been change for the better. In its first 2 years, there was stopping the boats, scrapping the carbon tax, mining tax, those 3 big trade deals, a massive spend on new roads that are only now being opened, and serious and pretty politically difficult budget repair. Since then, there's been modest income tax cuts, further solid tax cuts for business, and same-sex marriage. And through no fault of the government, mind you, the long-heralded surplus, of course, has become a $200 billion deficit. Now, left-wing Liberals, they'll say this doesn't matter. All that counts, they say, is placating the Green left because Conservative voters have nowhere to go. You've heard that before. It's this mindset that's driven the general drift to the left. Labor tries to be just a little bit more palatable than the Greens, and the Libs try to be just a little bit more palatable than Labor. Look at the polls, say the Liberal left. Yet Malcolm Turnbull, who usually polled relatively well, lost 14 seats to Labor in his one election, while Tony Abbott, who rarely was up in the polls, but who was never Labor-like, well, he won 25 seats from Labor in 2 elections. History shows that the Liberal Party succeeds best when it's led firmly from the centre-right. And regardless of what the current polls might tell us, it's the actual arithmetic that matters. Despite the general sense that the Morrison government is riding high, and there's a fair assessment of the mood there, the numeric reality is that the government's majority is just 2 seats. And the margins it needs to build and hold are in the outer metropolitan and regional seats that are focused on jobs and not politically correct gestures. Of course, all successful leaders have to be attentive to their backbench. But that doesn't mean allowing moralising from rich electorates to veto government policy. I've had almost 2 years, decades, experience drilling into the background of the people who usually vote for the coalition. And that base is overwhelmingly socially conservative and economically pragmatic. They don't see why it's right to export Australian coal to other countries, but not use it here. And uranium too, for nuclear power, if talk about lowering emissions from the left is really about the environment as opposed to a Trojan horse for socialism. Long-standing coalition voters are increasingly impatient with talk on energy and water. This is often raised with me, but can't understand why we haven't translated that into action, why we haven't been able to build a major new water storage in this country over the past 30 years, despite our population increasing by a third. And if I could be frank, coalition voters are getting pretty sick of electing MPs who sound conservative at branch meetings and in their country towns and suburbs, but seem to always side with the left in the party room in Canberra, and who are good at internal party intrigue, stacking branches, all the pre-selection fights, but have never had any sort of real job. So after a relentless year in 2020, the Prime Minister might be tempted to rest on his laurels. That's the last thing he can afford to do, because winning elections requires a record of achievement, not just another slate of promises. And while he's getting the job done, there's legitimate question marks over the performance of some of Morrison's ministers. It's easy for these inner-city libs to forget about regional and outer metro seats. These are the suburbs and towns too busy getting on with life, making ends meet, raising their families, to involve themselves in trendy obsessions. But the mistake these libs make is that because the libs choose the Prime Minister, they equate this with delivering government. Not true. Without the National Party, choose your leader if you like, libs, but without the National Party, you would forever be in opposition. While Albanese might be in trouble, never underestimate the ability of some tone-deaf libs to inflict self-harm. After all, Turnbull's loss of 14 seats in 2016 is a very real reminder that angry Conservatives will find somewhere else to go.